Welcome to this edition of Forecast Direct. I'm Leo Feler. I'm a senior economist with the UCLA Anderson Forecast. We're talking today with Professor Vernon Henderson of the London School of Economics. Professor Henderson's research and teaching focuses on urban economics and economic geography. Vernon, thanks so much for joining us. I'd like to ask you a few questions about the future of cities and specifically how the experience from this pandemic might change the future of cities. So starting off with the big picture, why do cities exist? What are the trade-offs when we think about living in cities versus living in more remote areas?
So, economists starting about 130 years ago started to write about why we have cities. And the central point is agglomeration benefits that pays in terms of productivity to have people cluster together. They're what we call information spillovers. So you learn by observing what other people are doing at close quarters, from talking with them, by meeting them in coffee shops, whatever the case may be, by seeing what gets shipped into their firm and what gets shipped out. We also think about trade in parts and reducing the distance on that to make it easier and to do special orders. We think about hiring and how you find people that you want to hire that are in the local area, again, through contacts. And we think of this as really working face to face. There's also public service provision, that there are big scale economies and things like providing water mains and sewer mains, and those are very expensive to do in rural areas. The disadvantage of cities are the high cost of living, right? You cram a bunch of people together. Say if you live in the center of Manhattan, you pay high rents. Why do you pay high rents? Well, because if you don't live in the center of Manhattan, you're going to live somewhere much further away. You're going to have to commute a long distance if you're actually commuting in. And so the people who live in the center of Manhattan pay high rents because they don't have to commute. So either you're going to commute a long distance, you're going to pay very high rents, or you're going to do some of both. We also now know that bigger cities, this is work from developing countries, present certain quality of life health issues, that people tend to have higher blood pressure, higher BMI, greater incidence of diabetes as you kind of go up in terms of urban density, city size.
So you have a paper that looks at creative jobs in advertising. So you're looking at networking on Madison Avenue. And this paper is from the early 2000s, before you have Zoom, but after you have internet, right? After you have emails. And so, I wanted to get a sense with you, why are these advertising firms co-locating so closely to each other? Is it just creative jobs that have this benefit of, close co-location? And what are the big takeaways from this paper? And then the reason that I'm setting this up is, I want to think about how does remote work change this?
Right. So in that paper, advertising agencies, a classic traditional role was the agencies were an intermediary between you, who had an ad that you wanted to place in some form of media, and the agency would do that placement and do that negotiation. And to some extent, that still holds for very big advertising firms that are doing huge media contracts and the like. But smaller firms, which is what we focused on in the paper that Leo mentioned, really have this more creative function of doing ads. So the way we thought of it is, you get a request for a proposal from to do or design an advertising campaign. Maybe 7 or 8 other firms have got that. You're in Lower Manhattan, there are 1,000 firms roughly. You have a set of contacts and usually neighbors that you interact with that may advise you about this request for proposal, because they won't be doing the same request for a proposal. And you try and design this campaign or potential campaign, and you take a lot of information and trade a lot of things with your neighbors. What we find in the paper is that people when they're deciding where to locate, they want to locate in a cluster with other advertisers like them. They're willing to pay considerably higher rents in order to do that. But we infer that these benefits of being close to other firms dissipate really quickly. So, if you're within 250 meters or 500 meters, that's really good. If you're more than 750 meters, these benefits die out. So that was based on face-to-face. And thinking about face-to-face, we did start to have Skype in those days, and I will talk about that. So Zoom is very much part of our lives now for the last 2 years or year and 3/4 since the pandemic started, but Skype was there before.
So does having this, not just the availability of the technology, but the adoption of this technology, right? So Zoom is much more pervasive right now, right? It's much easier to get people collaborating on Zoom. It's almost become an institutional staple of the way that we work over this past year and a half, and it doesn't seem like that's going to be changing anytime soon. So, does this change the nature of agglomeration economies? And by extension, does that change the nature of cities?
So, there's a lot of discussion of this, obviously, and given what's happened over the last couple of years. The original research on this and before Zoom really was thinking about the internet versus using the internet in general versus face-to-face contacts. And the idea in that work was that these were complements, so that with the internet, you could have a variety and see a variety of opportunities where you might buy things, people you might interact with, and so on. But to really make that work, you needed to meet them face to face. So to some extent, we think, well, you can meet them on Zoom, right? And you can, that can substitute for face to face. But, you think of the experience that we've had on Zoom. So a lot of what we're doing on Zoom is living off of past contacts. So I know Leo historically quite well. You can do this on Zoom. That's okay, but that's exploiting a past contact. We're looking to the future. For the last year and a half or 3/4, we've been living on those past contacts. You do meet new people on Zoom, but you meet them briefly, maybe you have a brief conversation, you can't see their body language, you don't have an extensive interaction, you're not going out to coffee with them, you're not having a meal with them, you're not meeting in another room, you're meeting on Zoom where it's sort of one person talks and then people occasionally jump in and stuff, but you're not meeting in a room where there's a freer sense of discourse. So there's certainly Zoom's going to be part of our lives. I'm a researcher. I work on big research teams that are around the world. So for example, right now we have a project that's based in Tanzania in Africa. And the principals are at the London School of Economics, but we meet once a week on Zoom because I'm actually in the US right now. Another principal is in Switzerland, and people are still coming into the office much less frequently. And then we have employees in Tanzania, full-time employees and part-time employees. If we could still travel, do face-to-face and go to Tanzania, it would make things easier, but these are contacts that we've known for a long time. That's why we can do this project. If we were starting from scratch and trying to do a project in Tanzania, working with Tanzania, it couldn't happen. It literally couldn't happen. We would have to have gone down there, spent time in the field, met with those people, gotten to know them, established a trust relationship. That's all face-to-face. So Zoom is going to make our lives easier in some ways and have less travel, less commuting, but the face-to-face part is not going to go away.
And that seems especially relevant right now when we think about as this pandemic ages, right? And as now we've been here a year and a half, you start having a lot of turnover at firms. You start having a lot of new employees coming in and who have never had the face-to-face contact. So they can't rely on that historical interaction and the historical relationships to be able to make their Zoom interactions more productive. So when we think about the impact that this is going to have on cities in the U.S. especially, right? Do you see cities in the U.S. Perhaps having slower growth if people aren't coming in as often, or if people are coming in only to establish those initial relationships, and then they're working from home part-time, working from cities, from offices the other remainder of the time? Does this change what cities have to offer?
Right. So it's a bunch of different kind of economic activities, right? And we're really talking about activities that are, let's call them business educational services, where there isn't a physical product or it isn't a personal service. So we know manufacturing can't be done on Zoom. You can't get your hair cut on Zoom. You can't eat a meal from a restaurant on Zoom. So we're talking about a particular set of activities. Those activities, and that's why Leo raised advertising, disproportionately occur in big cities, in the biggest cities and in the downtown areas. So, we think people have discovered that, if you don't commute, you save a lot of time. And if you can do a lot of your work remotely on computer, and then interact on Zoom, that you save a lot of time by commuting. So we're kind of seem to be moving in general to a world for these particular types of economic activity where you don't have to go in 5 days a week. You don't have to be there every day. You can go in twice a week, 3 times a week. And the rest of the time you can work at home. That means for businesses that their use of office space potentially is going to change. So, you see a couple of examples. The United Nations is talking about shutting down a bunch of office space and having employees work remotely and maybe come in to meet once a month, once every 6 months, and that'll save them an office space. If fewer people are coming in every day to the downtown, there's going to be less demand for the services that those people would use, like where you have lunch, or where maybe you get your hair cut, or whatever you did when you were downtown that now you might do somewhere else that's not downtown. So, I don't think this is probably not a time in many big cities where you want to be building office space. We're going to have a release of office space for an increase in essence in vacancy, and then maybe a reconfiguration of how that space is used. I don't know whether that's permanent. So the UN again, are they going to discover in 2 years from now, you got all these employees, they're all over the place, and we're not meeting enough, we're not seeing each other enough, we're kind of stagnant. I noticed there was an article on Price Waterhouse today asking where they are going to ask their employees to commit to whether they want to work remotely, in essence forever, or whether they still want to keep coming into the office. In a couple of years from now, will they turn around and say to these people who chose to work forever remotely, oh, this isn't really working out, we've kind of lost contact with you, you don't really know the people in our office, it's hard to launch new ventures with you, that kind of thing. So it seems that there's something to play with here where we can reduce our days that we commute in. But for most activities, to work remotely all the time is, I think, is going to be problematic.
And then I actually, I'd like to take this also on the social dimension, which is when we think about big cities, we also think about them providing things like helping with mentorship, helping people develop networks, helping people meet their future spouses, right?
Yes.
And so if you're not going into the office, if you're a young analyst at PricewaterhouseCoopers and you are, remote all the time, how do you develop this professional network? How do you, perhaps meet people who are going to be, your dates and your partners later on in life? How do you develop these friendships? It seems incredibly hard to do that when, everyone is looking at a screen and isolated in their homes or in suburbs.
No, I agree. I mean, I have somebody I know who's she's employed at Berkeley in a research institution and does scientific writing, and she's being remote now for the last year and a half. She lives on her own in an apartment in Berkeley, and says being kind of shut down for most of the last year and a half. Friends that she had made, a number of them actually left Berkeley, maybe because of the pandemic, and moved to other places. And it's hard to meet new people. It's hard to interact in your office because it's all on Zoom, and it really narrows your life to some degree. I mean, on the other side, I'm watching other people who are, say, couples with kids, and commuting is very costly for them. And if they're able to, stay home a couple of days a week and work at home, that's really convenient for their lives.
So perhaps this is something that, we'll have different stages, right? So during someone's early life stages, they're going into the office 4 or 5 days a week. They're developing that network, right? Their bosses and their mentors are coming in less frequently and interacting with them on Zoom. And you have this, it's hybrid in two senses, of the word, right? It's hybrid in the sense that people are staying at home and working sometimes, going into the office and working sometimes. But it's also, during your early career, you're coming in much more frequently. And perhaps later in your career, as you have kids, as you're managing, in your case, teams in much more disparate areas, right? It makes more sense to be on Zoom and be able to jump into meetings, in different locations, which you wouldn't be able to do as much, in a non-Zoom world.
Yeah, no, I agree with that. That's in fact an interesting point about career stage and how that works out. I don't know in this, in the more 50 years ago, people chose a career and they stayed in it their entire working life. Now people switch careers a lot. They switch jobs a lot. There's more mobility across careers and across job places. Will that be harder with Zoom? I suspect it is. It could be in a particular job that when you start that job, you go in quite a bit. You try to meet the people, even the ones that are working mostly remotely. You try and establish contacts. You get a more refined set of tasks assigned to you, or choose to take on a more refined set of tasks. And then, as you said, you can do many of those remotely. So again, it's not going to eliminate the face-to-face, the need to go to the office, but it's going to eliminate your need to commute, how far and how often you have to commute. And that can be really critical.
So do you think this helps equalize where a lot of, let's say, creative production takes place? So, an example is that during the pandemic, we saw smaller cities, Boise, Nashville, Fresno, Sacramento, right? Second and third tier cities actually gain a lot of population. We saw their home prices go up. So this is a signal that people believe that these cities are going to be doing well, not just now, but if they're willing to bid up housing prices and take 30-year mortgages and move out to these locations, it's a signal that they envision these places doing well in the long term. What's your view on whether this shift to away from, let's say, San Jose and San Francisco towards second-tier cities, whether or not that's sustainable?
Yeah, well, I'll give my reaction by giving an example. So I've owned a house in Providence, Rhode Island for many years, and we actually sold the house this spring because the market was so hot. And we were told that the person who was going to buy our house was somebody who sold a property in New York City, for example, in particular, got a huge amount of cash, came to Providence with all that cash and just pays cash for a house because Providence housing is cheaper, obviously, than Manhattan housing or New York housing more generally. And that is basically kind of what happened. And the idea was that people, with the reduced need to be in Manhattan or to be in the New York area every day could move further away from New York, maybe be near families, maybe be in just an environment that they thought was better for their kids, better schools, less less of the grime and crime of some parts of big cities. And you actually talk to people who are doing that. Again, the UN example of UN employees thinking, well, and I have examples of this, wanting to move away from the New York area in order to be closer to families, in order to have cheaper housing and bigger housing. I mean, one of the things with Zoom and working at home is that people decide they need more space, right? Because they want to have a more dedicated office space, a space where they can talk that's not in their living room where other family or household members might be coming through, so they want more space. So I do think there's going to be this rearrangement of space to some degree in the activities where this is relevant. Does that make Providence more creative? I'm not sure it does. Creativity is somehow still centered in New York. You have the people there. You have the people commuting in there now, not every day, but maybe once a week, or getting on the train and going down. And the creativity is still centered in New York. I guess that's the way I would think of it.
Excellent. So we can think about still kind of we call them productive amenities, right? The productive amenity is in New York. The consumption amenity is in Providence, Rhode Island, where you get to have a bigger house, you get to have more yard space, better schools, perhaps for your children. But this might also suggest, if where you're getting your haircut, where you're going out to restaurants is now in Providence, Rhode Island versus Manhattan.
Yes.
That also means a shift of, demand for these secondary support services, more in these second tier cities.
No, absolutely. So, if you walk through, I just, in fact, did this in the last week, walked through downtown LA, downtown Oakland, so many places, service places are boarded up because there's just not a demand for what they normally would offer. Some of them are reopening, but business is really slow because there's still not that many people coming in. So you do think of those services now shifting out to wherever these folks are living. That's really important. And I would emphasize that I think there is a life cycle part of this, so that if you're young and you don't have kids and moving to Providence to have those amenities is not so valuable. You do value what's in a big city. If you're older and your kids have grown up and left home, you like to go to the theater in New York. I mean, I like to go to the theater in London. One of the primary reasons I moved to London is because London's got a lot of great stuff compared to Providence, Rhode Island, as which you can appreciate once your kids are left home because you can consume it more easily.
Yeah, so I think I want to bring in one final data point here that I think is relevant and interesting. So we've been talking about a labor shortage, in the US and how hard it is to find workers for service jobs. One of the things that we haven't looked at is the disaggregation of where it's hard to find workers, right? And so, to your point, if people are moving out of Manhattan into Providence, Rhode Island, right, there needs to be this follow-on step of being able to get more service workers in Providence, Rhode Island. And now there's, a glut of service workers in downtown Manhattan. And that's the reallocation that we think is very difficult, that will still take a lot of time, right? Overall, across the country, the leisure and hospitality sector might have this surplus of workers, but that surplus is existing in Manhattan, where it's not existing in Providence.
No, that's a good point. We think of the shortage of workers. I mean, one way to think of it is that it's almost what we call in economics a regime switch. People in the US work enormously long hours compared to, say, Europe. And suddenly you have a pandemic, you're stuck at home, you start to develop other activities. Maybe you start to appreciate the leisure time that you have in the pandemic, that at least at certain points in the pandemic. And maybe you decide, I was crazy to be doing these jobs. And the interesting thing is, it seems that, everywhere you look, there's this problem of getting people to come back to work. And even once the unemployment benefits, extended benefits ran out, there was still a very slow return to the workforce amongst a segment of people. And it's not clear where that's going to go. Maybe it'll go back and we'll all be back on the rat race again and running in the mill compared to European countries and other parts of the world. But I'm not sure. But the point you make about reallocation is that, yes, I think that's really right. You've got these service workers and service firms in downtown Manhattan. Their businesses dropped. There's a demand for those services now in Providence. And, you know, these medium-sized cities or outlying cities that that people seem to be moving to some degree.
Perfect. Vernon, thank you so much. This was really insightful. I'm glad we were able to catch up and have this conversation.
Yeah, that's great, Leo. Good talking to you. Thanks for all this. Take care.
Thanks for joining us.